The moment Olive Garrison rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1878, she understood with cold clarity that the man who had promised her a new life had never intended to give her one. She sat atop a rented bay mare, her trunk strapped to the back of a borrowed wagon, her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days, and she stared at the saloon where Luther Gaines was supposed to be waiting for her. She had traveled 3 weeks from St. Louis on the strength of a stack of letters and a photograph of a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes. What she found instead was Luther Gaines slumped over a bar stool at 11 in the morning, a bottle of rye at his elbow, and a woman in a red dress draped across his arm. Olive did not cry. She had not cried since her mother's funeral 2 years prior, and she did not intend to start now. She climbed down from the wagon seat with careful dignity, tied the mare to the post outside the saloon, and walked inside with her spine straight and her chin level. "Luther Gaines," she said, her voice carrying across the sawdust-covered floor. The man blinked at her through bloodshot eyes. He looked nothing like his photograph. The kind eyes were now watery and vague, and the broad shoulders had gone slack with neglect. He did not appear ashamed. He appeared confused, which was somehow worse. "Well, I'll be," he said. "You actually came." "I actually came," Olive confirmed. "I sold my mother's house and traveled 1,900 miles because you told me in 14 separate letters that you were a rancher of good standing who wanted a wife and a partner and a future." She paused. "You told me you did not drink." Luther had the grace to look away from her, though the woman in the red dress only tightened her grip on his arm and studied Olive with flat, disinterested eyes. "Plans change," Luther said. "They certainly do," Olive replied, and she turned around and walked back out into the blinding New Mexico sunlight. She stood beside the mare for a long moment, her hands clasped in front of her, her mind working through the arithmetic of her situation. She had $11.40 in her purse. She had a trunk full of clothes and her mother's quilt and 3 books. She had no family left in St. Louis, no house to return to, and no money for a train ticket anywhere. She had, in the most literal sense, nothing but the clothes on her back and the mare she had rented from a livery in Santa Fe, and was already 3 days overdue to return. The street around her was alive with the ordinary business of a frontier town. Men moved along the boardwalks, horses stood at hitching posts, and somewhere down the street a blacksmith was working, the rhythmic clang of hammer on iron traveling through the warm morning air. Dusty Creek was not a large town. It had one main street, a general store, a post office, a church, a livery stable, the saloon, and a scattering of houses spreading out from the main thoroughfare toward the open desert beyond. It also had, she noticed, a notice board nailed to the post outside the general store. She walked to it. Most of the notices were ordinary: a reward for a missing mule, an advertisement for a seamstress, a church social on Saturday, and then near the bottom of the board, half covered by a handbill for patent medicine, a small square of paper in a careful, deliberate hand. It read, "Housekeeper and cook sought, Merritt Ranch 4 miles east of Dusty Creek on the Cimarron Road. Honest work, fair wages, private quarters. Inquire of Cecil Merritt or leave word at the general store." Olive read it twice. She was 24 years old. She had kept her mother's house through a long illness, could cook and sew and manage accounts, and she had absolutely nowhere else to go. She pulled the notice from the board, folded it, and put it in her pocket. Then she went into the general store and asked the woman behind the counter for directions to the Cimarron Road. The road east of Dusty Creek ran through country that took Olive's breath away despite everything. The desert opened up on either side of the packed dirt track, red and gold and vast, the scrub brushed silver-green in the morning light, and the distant mountains so sharp against the blue sky that they looked painted. She had grown up in Missouri, in a town with trees and rivers and the soft green edges of civilization, and this landscape was so different from anything she had known that, for a few miles, she forgot to worry about her situation and simply looked. The ranch announced itself first with a fence line, good solid posts with wire strung between them, stretching away from the road in both directions. Then came a gate with the letter M worked into the iron of the arch above it. Then a long drive lined with cottonwood trees that were just coming into leaf, their pale green rustling in the breeze, and at the end of the drive, the ranch itself. It was not what she expected. She had imagined something rough and makeshift, the kind of place that needed a woman's hand in every visible way. What she found instead was a house that had been built with care. 2 stories of adobe and timber with a covered porch running the length of the front, a garden bed along the foundation that had been recently turned over, and behind the house, a cluster of outbuildings that were solid and well-maintained. The fences were in good repair. The yard was swept clean. Someone here, she thought, took pride in the place. She dismounted at the porch steps and stood for a moment, uncertain. The front door opened before she could knock. The man who appeared in the doorway was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or 2 older, with dark hair that needed cutting and steady brown eyes that took in her face, her traveling clothes, the rented mare, and her expression in one measuring glance. He was lean and sun-darkened, wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he held a coffee mug in one hand as if she had interrupted his morning. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was calm and even, not unfriendly but careful. "I hope so," Olive said. "My name is Olive Garrison. I saw your notice at the general store in Dusty Creek. I am looking for work and I believe I am qualified for the position." He studied her for another moment. "You came from town just now?" "Yes." "You planning to stay in Dusty Creek?" It was a reasonable question, she supposed, given that she had arrived with a trunk on a rented horse and looked as though she had been traveling for 3 weeks, which she had. "I don't have anywhere else to be," she said, which was honest. He nodded slowly. "Come up on the porch then. I'll get you some coffee." His name was Cecil Merritt, and he was 31 years old, and the ranch had been his father's before it had been his. He had been running it alone for the past 3 years, since his father had died of a fever, and his younger brother had gone to California to seek his fortune and found it, more or less, in a mining town near Sacramento. Cecil had stayed because the land was his, and he was made of the same substance as the land, patient and enduring and rooted. He told her this over 2 cups of coffee on the porch, not because he was inclined to talk about himself, but because she asked direct, sensible questions and he found himself answering them. She wanted to know about the ranch, how many head of cattle he ran, whether he had hands employed, what the work would actually involve. He wanted to know about her, where she had come from and what her skills were, and she told him plainly and without embellishment, including the part about Luther Gaines, which she described in about 3 sentences with no visible emotion. "That's a hard thing to find at the end of a long journey," Cecil said. "It is," she agreed, "but I would rather know immediately than discover it gradually." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee mug. "What made you come out here in the first place?" "If you don't mind my asking." She considered the question. "My mother died 2 years ago. We had a small house and very little money, and I spent 2 years trying to make it work on my own. When Mr. Gaines wrote to me, it seemed like a real opportunity, starting fresh somewhere new." She paused. "I suppose I still want to start fresh somewhere new. This just isn't the arrangement I anticipated." "No," he agreed. "I imagine it isn't." He offered her the position. Room and board plus $10 a month, with her own room in the east end of the house and Sundays free. She accepted without haggling, because she was in no position to haggle, but also because something about Cecil Merritt felt honest. He was a man who said what he meant and did not appear to want anything from her beyond what he had asked for. That was more than she could say for Luther Gaines, and more than she could say for a fair portion of the men she had encountered in her life. She moved into the east room that same afternoon. The room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the garden bed and the open desert beyond, and a narrow bed with a good mattress, which she had not expected. She unpacked her trunk slowly, folding her mother's quilt over the foot of the bed, arranging her 3 books on the windowsill. When she was done, she stood in the middle of the room and breathed for the first time in what felt like weeks. She was safe. She was housed and employed and safe. Everything else could wait. Dinner that first evening was a quiet affair. Cecil had 2 ranch hands, a man named Domingo who was perhaps 40 and had been with the Merritt family for 12 years, and a younger man named Tom Whitfield who was 20 and had the permanent expression of someone slightly surprised to find himself wherever he was. They ate at the long table in the kitchen, and Olive had cooked the meal from what she found in the pantry, a stew with dried beef and potatoes and the last of a bag of dried beans and cornbread. She watched the way Cecil ate. He was neat and unhurried, and he said thank you when she set the bowl in front of him, which was not a given in her experience. Domingo smiled at her with genuine warmth. Tom Whitfield stared at his cornbread as though it had done something impressive. "This is the best meal this table has seen in about 8 months, Domingo told her, which she suspected was more encouragement than literal truth but appreciated nonetheless. "I'll take that as a good sign," she said. Cecil said nothing, but he had a second bowl of stew, and she decided that counted for something. The days that followed had a rhythm that Olive found herself settling into with surprising ease. She rose before dawn, lit the stove, and had breakfast ready when the men came in from the early morning chores. She kept the house, which was more of a task than it appeared from the outside because the ranch was a working operation, and the dust came in through every crack and gap in the adobe. She cooked 3 meals a day and kept the accounts, a task she had taken over from Cecil simply by asking one afternoon whether he would like her to, and he had handed her the ledger book with visible relief. She discovered within the first week that he was not a man who talked much, but that he talked with great deliberateness when he did, and that he listened with his full attention in a way that some people never managed. She also discovered that he was quietly, consistently kind in ways that he seemed unaware of, the way he always refilled her coffee cup without being asked, the way he brought in firewood before she had to mention it, the way he never once treated her as though she were merely a convenience. She noticed these things. She noted them carefully and then set them aside, because she had come to New Mexico territory with a head full of careful observations about Luther Gaines' letters, and she had been wrong about all of them. 2 weeks after her arrival, Cecil came in from the range with a gash on his forearm from a barbed wire fence that he had been trying to repair in the high pasture. It was deep enough to need attention, though he was treating it with the casual indifference of a man who had sustained 100 such injuries and would sustain 100 more. Olive sat him down at the kitchen table, heated water, found the clean cloth and the bottle of carbolic she kept in the medicine cupboard, and cleaned and bandaged the wound with practiced efficiency. He bore it without flinching, which she respected. "You've done this before," he said, watching her work. "My mother was ill for 2 years," she said. "I learned to manage most things." There was a pause, comfortable in the way that silences between them had started to become. She tied off the bandage and looked up and found him watching her with an expression she could not entirely read, something attentive and quiet and not quite hidden. "Thank you," he said. "Don't let it get infected," she replied, which was not the most romantic thing she had ever said, but it was practical, and she was a practical woman. Spring moved into summer and the territory heated up like the inside of a furnace. Olive learned the particular way the desert light fell in the late afternoon, turning everything amber and rust in deep shadow, and she found that she loved it with a fierceness that surprised her. She had not expected to love this place. She had not come here expecting to love anything at all, only to survive, and yet here she was. On Sunday afternoons, her free time, she took to walking out onto the land beyond the garden, following the dry creek bed that ran along the north edge of the property. Cecil had pointed it out to her in her first week, telling her it ran full in spring when the snow melted off the mountains and was bone dry by July, and she had been watching it dwindle with the season. One Sunday in late June, she walked out farther than usual, climbing a low rise of rock that gave a view across the whole valley. She could see the ranch below her, small and neat against the vast landscape, and beyond it the smudge of Dusty Creek, and beyond that the shimmer of the desert, and above it all the sky, which was a color she did not have a name for, something between blue and violet and the edge of darkness. She heard footsteps on the rock behind her and turned to find Cecil coming up the rise. "Domingo said you'd gone this way," he said, slightly out of breath from the climb. "I wanted to make sure you hadn't gotten turned around. It's easy to do out here when you first arrive." "I found the rise," she said. "I couldn't resist." He came and stood beside her, and they looked out over the valley together. The silence was full of the wind and the distant sound of cattle and the dry whisper of the scrub brush below. "You love it," he said. "It was not a question." "I didn't expect to," she admitted. "I thought I would learn to tolerate it, but I love it." He turned to look at her, and she could feel his gaze on her profile before she turned to meet it. When she did, he didn't look away. He held her eyes for a moment that stretched a little longer than strictly necessary, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something she had been very carefully not feeling for 6 weeks. "Good," he said quietly. And then he turned and looked back out over the valley, and she did the same, and they stood there on the rock until the sun started its long descent, and the shadows went purple and long across the desert floor. She told herself it meant nothing. She was an employee and he was her employer, and she was in no position to feel anything complicated about Cecil Merritt, and even if she were, she had spectacularly misjudged one man already this year. She told herself this every evening for the next 2 weeks. It was around this time that trouble arrived at Merritt Ranch in the form of a man named Bradford Cole. Cole rode in one Tuesday morning while Cecil was out on the range and Olive was alone in the house. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with a mustache that he appeared quite proud of, and the manner of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. He rode in with 2 riders at his back and tied up at the porch without being invited. Olive came to the door. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Cecil Merritt," Cole said, looking her over with an expression that managed to be both dismissive and intrusive at the same time. "He's out working," she said. "I'll tell him you called." "I'll wait," Cole said, and stepped up onto the porch without being asked. She did not move away from the door. "I'm afraid that's not convenient. If you leave your name, I will be sure he receives the message." Cole looked at her for a moment with an expression that suggested he was deciding whether she was worth the effort of displeasure. He apparently decided she was not. "Tell him Bradford Cole came to discuss the matter of the North water rights. He'll know what it means. And tell him I'm not a patient man." He left. Olive stood in the doorway and watched the 3 horses kick up dust on the road back to town, and she did not like any of it. When Cecil came in at noon, she told him about the visit immediately, not sparing any details. He listened with his characteristic stillness, and when she was done there was a tension in his jaw that she had not seen before. "Bradford Cole owns the Lazy Sea Ranch 12 miles north," he said. "He's been trying to acquire the North pasture water rights for 2 years. They're Merritt land and they always have been, but Cole has lawyers in Santa Fe who are happy to argue otherwise for the right fee." "Is this a serious legal dispute?" she asked. "It has the potential to be," he said. "Cole wants this land. Not just the water rights. He wants the whole ranch, and if he can't buy it he'll try to make things difficult enough that I have to sell." "What kind of difficult?" He looked at her with a candor that she appreciated. "The kind that involves lawyers and boundary disputes and maybe some missing cattle and nights where someone cuts your fence lines." "Ah," she said. "That kind." "Yes," he said. "That kind." In the week that followed, 2 things happened that brought the tension of Bradford Cole's ambitions into sharp relief. First, 30 head of cattle went missing from the North pasture, a number large enough to constitute a genuine loss. Second, a section of fence along the east boundary was found cut clean, not broken, cut deliberately with wire cutters. Cecil rode out to survey the damage with Domingo, and Olive went with them because she wanted to see it for herself, and he did not tell her she couldn't. She sat on the bay mare she had ended up keeping because she had paid its livery debt out of her first month's wages, and she looked at the cut fence and the wide empty space where 30 cattle had been. "This is coal," Domingo said flatly. It was not really a question. "Almost certainly," Cecil said. "But almost certainly and provably are different things." Olive looked at the cut ends of the wire. She was not a woman who knew ranching, but she had good sense, and she thought of the ledger book she kept and the accounts she managed and the patterns in the numbers she had begun to understand. "When did Cole first make an offer on the North Pasture rights?" she asked. Cecil looked at her. "About 2 years ago. And has there been missing cattle or fence damage before now?" "Small amounts, nothing like this." "And you mentioned last week that you've been approached by the Santa Fe Railroad about a right-of-way through the North Pasture." He went very still. "Yes." "Well," she said, looking at the cut fence, "I suspect Mr. Cole has heard the same thing and has decided that the land is now worth considerably more than it was 2 years ago, which means he's going to push harder." Cecil looked at her for a moment. "You're right," he said. "You need a lawyer," she said. "A good one. Not in Dusty Creek, but in Santa Fe. Someone who knows property law and isn't on Bradford Cole's payroll." Domingo made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and approval. Cecil was quiet for a moment, looking at the cut fence, then at the empty pasture, and then at Olive in a way that she had begun to recognize, that particular focus of his full attention. "I know someone in Santa Fe," he said. "A man named Hartwell. He's good." "Then write to him," she said. He did. And in the meantime she helped him document everything. She kept a record in a separate ledger of every incident, every date, every detail. She had been raised by a meticulous woman who believed that written records were a form of armor, and she applied that belief here with the same thoroughness she had applied to everything since her arrival. It was during this period that she and Cecil began to talk in the evenings. Not about Cole or the ranch or the legal situation, though those things came up, but genuinely the way two people talk when they are beginning to understand that the other person is worth knowing. He told her about his father, a man named Robert Merritt who had come to New Mexico Territory from Virginia in 1851, with nothing but a horse and the conviction that the land out here had something to offer a man who was willing to work for it. His father had been right, and he had built the ranch from nothing and left it to Cecil with the instruction to take care of it and take care of the people who depended on it. She told him about her mother, a woman named Clara who had played the piano and read constantly, and was the most stubbornly optimistic person Olive had ever known, right up until she could no longer get out of bed. She told him about the 2 years of her mother's illness, which had been the hardest and in some ways most important time of her life. She told him about the decision to answer Luther Gaines' advertisement, which in retrospect she could see had been less about Gaines and more about the desperate need to go somewhere and be something other than the woman keeping a dead woman's house. "You're not that anymore," he said one evening. They were on the porch after supper, the way they had taken to sitting in the cooler evening air, the desert going dark and full of stars around them. She had a cup of tea and he had coffee, and the night was quiet except for the distant sound of the cattle. "No," she agreed, "I'm not." "What are you now?" he asked, and his voice was careful, genuinely curious, not pushing. She thought about it. "I'm not entirely sure yet," she said, "but I think I'm someone who belongs here, somewhere on this land. I know that sounds strange, given that I've been here only 2 months. "It doesn't sound strange to me," he said. They sat in the quiet. The stars over the New Mexico desert were extraordinary, thick and dense, and so low it seemed like you could put your hand through them. She had noticed them every night since her arrival and never stopped being astonished by them. "Cecil," she said, and the name felt different when she said it now than it had in the beginning, more familiar, more comfortable, like a word she had been saying for years. "Yes," he said. She looked at him in the dark. "Why haven't you hired a housekeeper before? You've been here alone for 3 years." He was quiet for a moment. "I managed," he said, but I suppose the honest answer is that I wasn't sure about having someone else in the house. It was my father's house. I'm particular about it. And now," she said. He turned to look at her, and even in the dim light from the house behind them she could see his expression clearly enough. "Now it feels like it was supposed to have someone in it," he said. "I just didn't know what that looked like until recently." She looked away first, down at her tea, and she let the silence do the work that neither of them was quite ready to do with words. But she felt the warmth of it in her chest, steady and growing, and she did not try as hard as she had been trying to push it away. In July, Bradford Cole made his next move. It came in the form of a legal notice delivered by a rider from Santa Fe, claiming that the water rights to the North Pasture Spring had never been properly transferred to the Merritt family from the original territorial grant, and that Bradford Cole, having acquired certain adjacent property, was petitioning the territorial court for recognition of his claim. The notice was thick and dense with legal language and looked formidable. Cecil brought it to Olive and sat across from her at the kitchen table while she read it. She read it twice, carefully. "This is serious," she said. "This is a real legal challenge." "I know. Has Hartwell responded to your letter yet?" "He wrote back yesterday. He's willing to take the case. But it's going to cost money and it's going to take time, and in the meantime Cole can do a great deal of damage." She set the notice down and looked at him. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before, not physically tired but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from fighting something that should not need fighting. She felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her that she did not bother to analyze. "Then we prepare," she said. "Your father had records, did he not? Deeds and grants and correspondence with the Territorial Land Office. In the study, in the big wooden chest. Then that is where we start." She stood up. "After breakfast." They spent 3 days in the study together, going through every document in the wooden chest, which turned out to be extensive. Robert Merritt had been as meticulous as Olive's own mother, and there were letters and receipts and original grant documents going back to 1851. Olive organized them chronologically and by subject, creating a clear record of the property history that she then summarized in a detailed letter to Hartwell in Santa Fe. Working alongside Cecil in the close, paper-smelling space of the study, she learned things about him that she would not have learned otherwise. She learned that he read with his forefinger tracing the line of text, a small habit that she found endearing. She learned that, when he found something significant, he would go very still for a moment before showing it to her, as though he needed to process it privately first. She learned that he did not swear in front of her even when he was clearly frustrated, though she heard him occasionally under his breath when he thought she wasn't listening, and she found this combination of restraint and authenticity very much in character. On the third afternoon, he found the original 1856 deed that explicitly named the North Spring as part of the Merritt grant with full water rights attached. He went very still for a moment, and then he turned and held it out to her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, pure, uncomplicated relief. She took it, read it, and looked up at him. "This is what we need," she said. "Yes," he said. "Yes, it is." And without really thinking about it, without the premeditation that might have made it awkward, she reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the desk between them. He looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then he turned his hand over and held hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do any of this." "I wanted to," she said, which was entirely true. He held her hand for a moment longer, warm and steady, and then released it, and they both went back to the documents as if nothing had changed, though of course everything had. She lay awake that night for a long time. She was not a woman who fooled herself. She knew what she felt. She had been feeling it for weeks with increasing clarity, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, the slow-building certainty of something inevitable. She was in love with Cecil Merritt, or very close to it, which amounted to the same thing. She loved the steadiness of him and the quiet care of him, and the way he looked at the land as though it were alive and deserved respect. She loved the way he listened to her, and the way he did not explain things to her unnecessarily, and the way he had looked at her tonight with that expression she kept replaying. But she was also a practical woman in a practical situation, and she was still his employee, and she still did not know with any certainty what he felt. She had learned that much from Luther Gaines, the danger of building a world inside someone else's letters and finding it empty when you arrived. She was not going to do that again. She would wait. She would be patient. She was good at patience. The document package went to Hartwell in Santa Fe, and he responded with confidence that the case was strong. In the meantime, Cecil began writing the fence lines himself every day, and Domingo and Tom Whitfield doubled up on watching the north pasture. The missing 30 cattle never turned up, which was a loss Cecil absorbed without complaint, though Olive knew from the accounts exactly how much it cost. One late July afternoon, Tom Whitfield came back from town with news that Bradford Cole had been in the saloon the previous night talking loudly about how he intended to have the Merritt North pasture, one way or another, which was the kind of statement that carried a weight of meaning in the territory that it would not have carried in a courthouse in St. Louis. Cecil heard the report without visible reaction. Afterward, he went out to the barn and stayed there for longer than the chores required, and Olive went out after him. She found him in the back of the barn, his arms resting on the gate of an empty stall, looking at nothing in particular. "You don't have to be alone with it," she said from the door. He turned, not startled, as though he had heard her coming. "Come in," he said. She came and stood beside him, mirroring his posture, arms on the gate, looking at the same stretch of empty stall. It smelled of hay and horses and warm wood. "I'm not going to lose this ranch," he said, and his voice was quiet and absolute. "No," she said, "you're not. My father spent 30 years building it. Every fence post and water trough and head of cattle he built from nothing. He told me once that the land didn't care who you were or where you came from or what you'd been, only whether you were willing to work and stay." He paused. "I've been willing." "I know you have," she said. He looked at her sideways. "When you first rode up here," he said, "I thought you'd be gone within a month. City woman, wrong idea of what life out here was going to be like." He paused. "I was wrong about that." "You were," she agreed, but she was smiling. "You're the most capable person I have on this ranch," he said, "which is saying something because Domingo has been doing this for 30 years. Domingo would be horrified to hear you say that. Domingo said it to me himself last week." She laughed, a real laugh, and he turned fully toward her with an expression she had only been glimpsing in pieces and was now seeing whole. He was looking at her with such open, unhidden warmth that it stopped her breath for a moment. "Olive," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not really an answer to anything he had asked yet but felt like one. "I have not been very good at saying what I mean," he said. "About certain things, I am better with actions than with words." He paused. "But I think some things should be said plainly so there's no confusion." "I appreciate plain speaking," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I'm glad you came to Dusty Creek," he said. "I'm glad you saw that notice. I'm glad you rode out here. And I am glad every morning that you are here, and I would be sorry, very sorry, if you were not." She looked at him in the dim warmth of the barn, this careful, steady, honest man who had given her work and shelter and space and time, who had never pushed her or pressured her or asked her to be anything other than what she was, and she felt the last careful distance she had been keeping close herself. "I'm glad, too," she said. "All of those things." He reached out and touched her face, gently, the way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to touch yet, and she leaned into it, and he exhaled slowly. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. He smiled, and it transformed him, this man who was usually so contained. It was a full, unguarded smile, and she thought she would spend a very long time being glad she had seen it. He kissed her once, brief and soft and full of everything that had been building for months, and then stepped back with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, honoring the promise of doing this right. "Supper is going to burn," she said. "Yes," he said, and they walked back to the house together in the last golden light of the July afternoon. What followed was the most extraordinary season of Olive Garrison's life. Cecil Merritt courted her with the same attention to detail and the same quiet seriousness he brought to everything else. He was not a man for grand gestures, but he was a man for consistent, genuine ones. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow above the north pasture, the hardy desert blooms of late summer, yellow and red and pale lavender. He rode into Dusty Creek one Saturday and came back with a book he had ordered from the general store because she had mentioned the author once in passing, 6 weeks earlier, not expecting him to have noted it. She had noted it. She had been noting everything. They took to riding together on Sunday afternoons, following the fence lines or climbing the rock rise above the valley or simply riding out into the open desert because the land invited it. The vast and indifferent and beautiful desert that was becoming, inch by inch, the thing she thought of when she thought of home. He told her about the stars. He had learned them from his father, who had learned them navigating by night on the journey from Virginia, and he knew them by name and habit, and by the way they moved through the seasons over the New Mexico sky. He pointed them out to her on the long summer evenings on the porch, Scorpius low on the horizon, the bright fixed point of Vega, the slow wheel of the Milky Way overhead. She told him about music. She could not play any more, there being no piano at the ranch, but her mother had taught her and she had loved it, and she found herself talking about it with a longing she had not acknowledged since leaving St. Louis. 3 weeks later, in the most impractical and significant thing she had ever known him to do, Cecil wrote to a man in Santa Fe who dealt in second-hand instruments and inquired about the possibility of acquiring a piano. "That is an enormous expense," she said when she found out, not because she wanted him to stop but because she wanted him to know that she knew. "The parlor doesn't have enough in it," he said. "The parlor has a good rug and 2 chairs and a side table," she said. "Exactly," he said, and his tone said the rest. The piano arrived in September on a freight wagon, an upright instrument that had seen considerable use but was in good tune, and Domingo and Tom Whitfield and Cecil wrestled it into the parlor with an amount of effort and creative language from Tom that Olive pretended not to hear. She sat down at the bench and put her hands on the keys and played a few tentative notes and then a scale, and then, before she entirely meant to, a waltz her mother had taught her, one she had not thought of in 2 years. When she finished, she turned to find Cecil leaning in the doorway with his arms folded and a look on his face that she had come to think of as the particular look he kept for her alone. "You play beautifully," he said. "I'm very rusty," she said. "Play it again," he said. She played it again. August and September brought the legal proceedings to a head. Hartwell sent word from Santa Fe that Bradford Cole's lawyers had filed their formal challenge, and that the hearing before the territorial land judge was set for early October. Cecil made plans to go to Santa Fe for the hearing, and Olive made plans to go with him. "You don't need to come," he said. "It could be a week, maybe 2. Hartwell needs to know about the documents," she said. "I organized them and I know where everything is and what it means. I'll be more useful there than here." He did not argue, which she appreciated. She had learned that he was not a man who argued with good sense on principle. They traveled to Santa Fe in the 2nd week of September, taking the mail stage because the road was not safe to travel alone with the coal business making everyone edgy. Domingo stayed to run the ranch with Tom, and they rode into Santa Fe in the cool of the early morning, with the mountains enormous to the east and the old city spread before them, all adobe and history and the smell of wood smoke and chili and the ancient permanence of the place. Santa Fe was nothing like Dusty Creek. It was the territorial capital, old in a way that frontier towns were not, shaped by Spanish and then Mexican and then American hands over centuries, and it moved with a different kind of energy, more layered and complicated. Olive found it fascinating and slightly overwhelming after 3 months of the ranch's quiet. They stayed at a respectable boarding house near the plaza, in separate rooms, because Cecil Merritt was a man of correct behavior even when it was inconvenient. He had not yet asked her to marry him. She had thought about why, and she had concluded that he was waiting for the Cole situation to be resolved before adding any other large thing to the immediate landscape of his life. It was a patient choice and a practical one, and she understood it, though she would not have objected to him being slightly less patient. They met with Hartwell the next morning. He was a compact, quick man of about 50 with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and he had reviewed all the documents Olive had organized and sent ahead. "The 1856 deed is definitive," he told them, setting it on the desk between them. "The language is clear, the signature and seal are proper, and the territorial records in the land office confirm it. Cole's lawyers are good, but they're working with a case that isn't there." "What's their argument?" Cecil asked. "They're claiming an irregularity in the 1851 original grant, arguing that the spring was not covered by the grant's geographic description and therefore reverted to unclaimed territory. They have a surveyor who is willing to testify to their interpretation of the boundaries." Hartwell paused. "But you have Olive's summary of the document chain, which makes it very clear that Robert Merritt consistently maintained and was consistently recognized as the owner of the spring from 1851 through your inheritance. Quiet title, continuous use, documented recognition. Their surveyor is going to have a very bad morning." Cecil glanced at Olive. She looked at the table to hide a smile. The hearing took place over 2 days before Judge Aloysius Warren, a territorial judge of considerable experience and visible impatience with time wasting. Bradford Cole was present with his lawyers, a team of 3 men from a Santa Fe firm, and he watched Cecil across the courtroom with the cold calculation of a man who expected to win. Hartwell was methodical and thorough. He entered every document Olive had organized into the record, walked the judge through the chain of title, and presented the history of the Merritt family's continuous, open, and exclusive use of the North Pasture Spring from 1851 to the present. Cole's surveyors testified, and Hartwell cross-examined them with the 1856 deed open in front of him, until their interpretation of the boundaries began to look like what it was, a construction built to serve a predetermined conclusion. On the second afternoon, Judge Warren called both parties to the bench and told Cole's lead attorney, with the bluntness of a man who had heard too many speculative arguments, that he was prepared to rule in favor of the Merritt family on the grounds that the documentary evidence was conclusive and the challenge was without sufficient merit. Cole turned red. His attorneys talked quietly and urgently. The judge waited with the patience of a man who did not need to hurry. After several minutes, Cole's lead attorney asked to approach and spoke with Hartwell in a low voice. Then Hartwell came to Cecil and Olive and told them that Cole was prepared to formally withdraw his claim to the water rights in exchange for a covenant from Cecil not to pursue damages for the missing cattle or the cut fences. Cecil looked at Olive. "Take it," she said quietly. "You get what matters. The land is secure. The rest costs more than it's worth." He considered it for a moment, then nodded at Hartwell, who relayed the answer. The agreement was drafted and signed before court adjourned that afternoon. Bradford Cole left the courthouse without looking at either of them, and he never again set foot on Merritt land. Outside on the plaza in the warm October afternoon, Santa Fe going about its business around them, Cecil stopped walking and turned to face Olive. He looked at her with an expression that was composed of relief and gratitude and something larger and deeper than either. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. He reached out and took both her hands in his, which he had not done in public before, and held them carefully. "Olive," he said. "Cecil," she said. "I have been waiting to ask you something until this was settled," he said. "I wanted there to be nothing hanging over it. Nothing unresolved." Her heart was making a considerable noise in her chest, but she kept her face calm and attentive. "I know that you came out here under difficult circumstances," he said, "and that you have had every reason to be cautious, and that I have not made things easy by being the kind of man who needs a great deal of time to say what he means. But I mean this." He held her hands a little more firmly. "I love you. I have been in love with you since somewhere around the middle of that first week when you reorganized my kitchen so efficiently that I couldn't find the coffee for 2 days." She laughed despite herself. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not because the ranch needs a housekeeper, though you are a magnificent one, but because you are the person I want to be with every morning and every evening and every difficult thing in between. Because the ranch feels like it has its soul back since you arrived. Because you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known." He paused. "And because I suspect that if I don't ask you now, I will regret it for the rest of my life." She looked at him in the Santa Fe afternoon, this man who had given her back a sense of home and purpose, and the extraordinary gift of being known and wanted for exactly who she was, not a construction of 14 letters but the actual, complicated, capable, determined woman she was. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her right there in the middle of the plaza, which was not how she had imagined it, but which was exactly right. They were married in November, in the Dusty Creek Church, which was a small adobe building with a wooden floor and windows that let in the enormous New Mexico sky. Domingo stood with Cecil, looking as though he had suspected this outcome for some time. The congregation was most of the town, because towns like Dusty Creek paid attention to their own, and a few of the neighboring ranchers, and a woman named Esther Pratt who ran the general store and had been quietly kind to Olive since her arrival, and had become something approximating a friend. Olive wore the best dress she owned, a deep green wool she had made over from something her mother had left her, and she carried a small bunch of the last autumn wildflowers from the north pasture meadow. She walked down the aisle of the small church toward Cecil, who was standing very straight and watching her with that expression she thought of as entirely her own, and she did not feel the nerves she had expected to feel. She felt only the deep certainty of a right thing happening in a right way. The ceremony was simple. The words were the old words, honest and serious, and she meant every one of them completely. Afterward there was food and music in the church hall, and Tom Whitfield turned out to be an unexpectedly good fiddle player, and the evening went long and warm, and full of the laughter of people genuinely glad to celebrate something good. Late in the evening, Olive stood with Cecil on the church steps in the cold November night, the stars overhead the same extraordinary density they had been every night since her arrival. The noise of the celebration was muffled behind them. She could see their breath in the cold air. "Are you happy?" he asked, and the question was careful and genuine as his questions always were. "Enormously," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood looking up at the stars over the New Mexico desert. "My father used to say," Cecil said, "that this land takes a long time to trust you, and that when it does, it gives you everything." "He was right," Olive said. He held her closer. "Yes," he said, "he was." The winter that followed was the first Olive had spent on the ranch, and it was different from what she had imagined. The desert cold was sharp and deep at night, the kind of cold that came off the high mountains and settled into the bones of the earth, and the mornings were hard with frost on the ground and the horse's breath steaming in the paddock. But the days were often clear and brilliant, the winter light flat and white and striking, and the nights were the coldest and most beautiful she had ever known. She learned new things about the ranch and about her husband in every season. Cecil in winter was quieter than Cecil in the working months, more reflective, more present in the house. He read in the evenings by the fire, good long books, and she played the piano and they talked in the easy way of two people who had decided on each other completely. Domingo came for Sunday dinners and brought stories of the territory in the old days, the years before the ranch was the ranch, and Olive listened with the same attention she brought to everything, building the history of the place inside herself, the way a person builds a home. In February, she told Cecil that she was expecting their first child. He was standing at the kitchen stove pouring coffee when she said it, and he turned around very slowly with the coffee pot in his hand and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something so open and unguarded that it was almost difficult to look at directly. "Are you certain?" he said. "Quite certain," she said. He set the coffee pot down with great deliberate care and came to her and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her for a long moment. "Olive," he said, and his voice was full. "I know," she said. He held her for a long time there in the kitchen in the winter morning light. The pregnancy brought its difficulties, as pregnancies did. The first months were hard, with a persistent sickness that she handled with the same practical determination she brought to everything, but that she found genuinely unpleasant. And Cecil responded by being quietly, attentively present without hovering or fussing, which was exactly the right response. He took over the accounts and the heavier household work without being asked, and when she told him she felt well enough to help, he let her, which was also the right response. Spring came again, Olive's second spring on the ranch, and she watched the desert come alive with the particular exuberance of the Southwest after winter. The wildflowers on the rock rise, the pale green new growth on the cottonwoods, the dry creek running full with snowmelt the way Cecil had told her it would. She was 6 months along, and the shape of her life was so different from anything she had imagined a year earlier that sometimes she stood at the kitchen window looking out at the land and felt something she could only describe as wonder. She wrote to Esther Pratt about a doctor, because the nearest physician was in Santa Fe, and that was a long journey in the later months. And Esther mentioned a woman in Dusty Creek named Mrs. Avila, who had delivered most of the territory's babies for 20 years and was, Esther said, the most competent person she knew in any field. Olive made inquiries and found this to be a general consensus, and she called on Mrs. Avila and liked her immediately. A solid, unhurried woman of about 60 who spoke with an accent that was half Spanish and half something older than either, and who looked at Olive's overall health with the assessing eye of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "You are strong and healthy and you will do well," Mrs. Avila told her, which was exactly what she needed to hear, and said without sentimentality. Tom Whitfield had a minor adventure in March when he and Domingo were riding the north fence and encountered 3 men they did not recognize making camp on the Merritt property just inside the boundary line. The men were politely but firmly escorted off the land, and when Cecil rode out to examine where they had been, he found signs of survey work, a stake here, a marker there. He wrote to Hartwell in Santa Fe describing what had been found. Hartwell responded that Bradford Cole had recently sold the Lazy C Ranch to a land speculation company out of Denver, and that it was possible the survey work was related to a new inquiry into the railroad right-of-way negotiations, which were still proceeding. He advised Cecil to formalize his own survey of the ranch boundaries and file an updated plat with the Territorial Land Office, which Cecil proceeded to do with the same thorough attention he brought to everything. Cole was gone from the territory entirely by summer, which Tom Whitfield reported with evident satisfaction, and Domingo received with quiet relief, and Cecil noted without comment, though Olive saw his shoulders drop slightly when he heard it, the release of a long-held tension. The railroad right-of-way was eventually negotiated that summer, a corridor through the southern edge of the North Pasture that gave Merritt Ranch rail access to the cattle market in Albuquerque, and the considerable financial benefit that came with it. Cecil negotiated it himself with Olive at the table beside him, reviewing the documents with the same thoroughness she had applied to everything since her arrival, and the railroad representative came away from the meeting looking slightly surprised at the precision of the counter-proposals. "You are remarkable in a negotiation," Cecil told her afterward. "My mother taught me that if you understand the numbers, the words take care of themselves," she said. "Your mother was a very wise woman," he said. "She was," Olive agreed. "The baby was born in June, early in the morning with Mrs. Avila's capable hands and Esther Pratt, who had come out from Dusty Creek to be with Olive through it, sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee and reassuring Cecil, who was at his most uncomposed he had ever been. It was a boy. A healthy, loud, immediately indignant boy who announced himself to the New Mexico morning with a considerable volume that made Mrs. Avila nod with satisfaction. Cecil held his son for the first time sitting on the edge of the bed beside Olive, both of them worn and incandescent, and he looked at the small red face with the careful, particular attention he gave to everything that mattered. "Robert," Olive said, "for your father." Cecil looked at her, and for a moment his composure was entirely gone, which she had seen before and which she loved every time. "Robert," he said. Robert Merritt came into the world in June of 1879 and immediately and permanently rearranged everything. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's determined expression, and he slept badly for the first 3 months in a way that was comprehensive and consistent, and made Olive and Cecil both mildly delirious by August, at which point he abruptly and without explanation began sleeping through the night, and they both slept 12 hours straight and woke up feeling like themselves again. Domingo became a devoted presence around the baby in the quiet, slightly awkward way of a man who loves children, but does not quite know what to do with them in the very early stages. Tom Whitfield held Robert once, with the expression of a man diffusing something delicate, and returned him to Olive with visible relief. Mrs. Avila came to check on them both in the first weeks and pronounced the baby excellent, and the mother recovering well and advised Cecil to let Olive sleep when the baby slept, which he did, standing outside the bedroom door with an expression that defied anyone to disturb the peace. Life on Merritt Ranch in the latter half of 1879 had a particular quality that Olive would think of in later years as the richest kind of ordinary. It was not dramatic. The coal affair was resolved. The railroad deal was done. The accounts were solid and growing. Cecil was building a new outbuilding in the West Yard, and Tom had hired on his younger cousin, a boy of 22 named Patrick who was hardworking and cheerful, and became devoted to the ranch with a speed that suggested he had found his place. Olive played the piano in the evenings when the baby was asleep, and Cecil read, and sometimes they sat together on the porch in the New Mexico night the way they had been sitting since that first summer, only now there was the presence of the baby in the house behind them, a small, steady breathing presence that made everything feel anchored. "Do you miss St. Louis?" Cecil asked her one evening, November now, Robert 4 months old and asleep inside. She thought about it honestly. "I miss what it was before my mother was gone," she said. "I don't miss what it became after. This is home." She paused. "This has been home for a long time." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had in the study over the documents, easy and natural, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the stars overhead were everything they had always been. In the spring of 1880, when Robert was just learning to pull himself upright against the furniture, and to look at the world with enormous brown eyes that were very like his father's, Olive discovered she was expecting again. She told Cecil over breakfast, which was becoming something of a tradition with significant news, and he had the coffee pot at a safer distance this time, so there was no near accident. "Another one," he said, and he was smiling before he finished the sentence. "Another one," she confirmed. "Around October, I think." He came around the table and kissed her in the morning light, unhurried and warm, and Robert, in his chair, waved a piece of bread in their direction with the democratic approval of a child who did not yet make distinctions between significant moments and ordinary ones. The summer of 1880 was a good summer on the ranch. The cattle operation had expanded since the railroad deal, and Cecil had taken on 2 more hands, bringing the crew to 5. The North pasture, the source of so much trouble the year before, was producing well, the spring running clear and the grass coming in thick. The accounts showed the best numbers since Olive had taken them over. She managed the household through the pregnancy with her customary efficiency, though she conceded some of the heavier work to Patrick's cousin's wife, a young woman named Mee who had come from Texas with a cheerful competence that Olive liked immediately. Mee helped with the cooking and the heavier cleaning and proved to be excellent company, and Robert adored her with the wholehearted commitment of a 15-month-old. Cecil spent a great deal of time that summer on the fences and the water systems, preparing the ranch for the next year's expanded operation, and he and Olive had long evening conversations about the plans, the numbers, the things they wanted to build. He had stopped, entirely and naturally, treating the ranch as his thing and her thing as the house. They ran it together, in the collaborative and complementary way that had developed from their very first week, and he brought the same respect to her opinions about the cattle operation that she brought to his opinions about the household, which was simply the logical result of two intelligent people paying attention to each other. One August evening, sitting on the porch with Robert toddling unsteadily around the yard in the last of the daylight, Cecil said, "My brother is coming to visit." Olive looked at him. He had spoken of his brother James in California, but she had never met him. "When?" "September. He's coming through on business and wants to see the ranch." He paused. "And wants to meet you. He wrote and said it was unacceptable that he had not met you yet." "It has been nearly 2 years," she observed. "He is not entirely wrong," Cecil admitted. James Merritt arrived on the 1st of September on the stage from Albuquerque, a man of 27 who looked enough like his brother to be clearly family, but who had an entirely different energy, louder and more expansive, with a grin that appeared at a fraction of the provocation of Cecil's quieter version. He shook Cecil's hand, and then turned to Olive with the same grin and said, "You are considerably more impressive than your letters suggested, and the letters were already impressive." "Thank you," she said. "You are more effusive than your letters suggested, and the letters were already effusive." He burst out laughing, and Cecil looked at them both with the satisfaction of a man whose two favorite people have met and are getting along. James stayed 2 weeks and was genuinely useful, riding fence and helping with the early autumn cattle work with the knowledge of a man who had grown up on a ranch, even if he had exchanged it for California. He and Olive talked at length, which Cecil observed with a quiet pleasure, and James told her things about Cecil's younger years that she filed carefully away. The boy who had climbed every high place on the ranch to look at the view, the young man who had stayed when everyone else had expected him to go, the person who had written to James in California describing his new housekeeper in terms that James said had told him everything he needed to know within the first paragraph. "What did he say?" Olive asked. James grinned. He said she was highly capable and extremely organized, and he thought she had probably been underestimated by most people for most of her life. He wrote it like it was a professional observation, but it didn't read that way. "When was this?" she asked. "About 3 weeks after you arrived." She looked over at Cecil, who was watching them from across the yard with his calm, unhurried gaze. 3 weeks, she thought. She had been fighting it off for considerably longer than that. James went back to California with obvious regret and the clear intention of returning the following year, and he did, but that is further along. In October, with the aspen above the high meadow gone gold and the mornings crackling with cold, Olive's second child arrived. This time it was a girl. Small and precise and immediately attentive to everything, with Olive's dark eyes and a calm that Mrs. Avila remarked on as unusual in a newborn. "She is looking at everything already," Mrs. Avila said with approval. "That's her mother's influence," Cecil said, and Olive, exhausted and brilliant and entirely done with being pregnant, laughed from the pillow. They named her Clara for Olive's mother. Cecil had suggested it before Olive did, which she discovered when she proposed it, and he told her he had been carrying the suggestion for 2 months waiting to see if she would arrive at it herself. "You could have simply said so," she told him. "I wanted it to be your idea," he said. Robert, who was 16 months old and in the early stages of acquiring language with great ambition, stood in the doorway of the bedroom and studied his sister with a serious expression, then said a word that was close enough to her name to count as a genuine first attempt. And Olive and Cecil looked at each other over his head, with the shared silent language of two people who have been paying close attention to each other for long enough to not need words for everything. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was a full house. Robert was everywhere at once, a dark-haired, steady-footed toddler who had inherited his father's deliberateness and his mother's organizational instincts, already attempting to arrange his wooden blocks in patterns that had some internal logic only he fully understood. Clara was quieter, watchful, spending long hours in her mother's arms or in the cradle by the parlor fire, absorbing the world with that attentive calm she had arrived with. Cecil was, as a father, everything Olive had known he would be and more. He was patient with the particular patience of a man who does not confuse importance with urgency, who understood that the small moments were the significant ones and gave them their full weight. He was up in the nights when the children needed it without being asked, and he brought the same quality of full attention to his son's block arrangements and his daughter's first attempts at focus that he brought to fence lines and legal documents. It was one of the many things she loved about him, the consistency of that attention. She told him so one winter evening, sitting by the fire with Clara asleep in her arms and Robert long since in bed and Cecil across from her with a book held but not really read. "What?" he said, looking up from the unread page. "I love the way you pay attention," she said, "to everything, to the land and the cattle and the accounts and the fence lines and the children and me. You never give something less than your full attention." He looked at her with that expression, the one she thought of as entirely hers. "You do the same," he said. "You have since the first day." "I learned some of it from you," she admitted. "You brought most of it with you," he said. She smiled at him over the baby's sleeping head. "We're not bad together," she said. "No," he agreed, and his voice held everything. "We're not bad together." Spring came around again, the third spring on Merritt Ranch, and Olive stood at the kitchen window watching the cottonwoods come into leaf along the drive while Robert sat on the kitchen floor building something ambitious, and Clara lay in the morning light on a blanket doing her serious observing of the ceiling. Cecil was out with Domingo doing the early morning work that started a ranching day, and she could see them through the window, two figures moving across the yard with the purposeful ease of long practice. She thought about that morning a year after her arrival when she had stood in this window and thought of the ranch as a place she was learning. It was not that anymore. It was the place she had come from, the place she was, the ground beneath everything. She thought about the woman who had tied a bay mare to a post outside a saloon in Dusty Creek and walked in to find that everything she had planned was wrong. She felt a kind of distant compassion for that woman, who had been so determinedly unbroken and so secretly frightened, who had walked to a notice board and made the best decision of her life without knowing it. She felt grateful for Luther Gaines, which surprised her every time she came to it, not for what he had done, which was dishonest and unkind, but for the fact that his failure had put her on the road to Merritt Ranch. She would not wish the experience on anyone, but she could not regret the path. The summer of 1881 brought James again, and this time he brought a woman with him, a schoolteacher from Sacramento named Harriet who had dark red hair and an accurate eye for everything, and Olive liked her immediately with the recognition of one capable woman for another. James and Harriet were not yet engaged, but the signs were clear enough, and Olive and Cecil had a conversation about it on the porch that evening after the guests were inside that was mostly conducted in the kind of glances and half-sentences that two people develop after sufficient time together. "He is very settled around her," Cecil observed. "And she is not at all settled around him," Olive said, "which is probably good for him." Cecil considered this. "You think so?" "He needs someone who is not simply pleased by everything he does," she said. "Harriet clearly has opinions." "You have opinions," Cecil noted. "Is that a problem?" she said. "It is entirely the opposite of a problem," he said. Harriet and James announced their engagement before the visit was over, and Olive played the piano that evening in celebration, and Domingo appeared with a bottle of good wine he had been keeping for a significant occasion, and Tom Whitfield played the fiddle, and even Patrick's wife me danced, and it was a good evening, full and warm, and exactly the kind of evening that a ranch should have. Robert, 2 years old and in full magnificent command of language, asked James very seriously if he was going to live on the ranch now, and James said not exactly. California was his home now, and Robert accepted this with the grave nod of a child processing information. "He is exactly like you," James told Cecil. "He has a great deal of his mother in him," Cecil said, which Olive appreciated but thought was probably only half true. The steadiness and the attention were Cecil's. The organizational impulse was hers. The combination was Robert. Clara, at 10 months, had begun doing the thing babies do when they are just discovering they can move themselves. The fierce and committed crawling toward whatever has attracted the full beam of her attention, and she pursued the family dog, an old ranch dog named Miller who had arrived a year before, with a single-mindedness that Miller bore with philosophical resignation. In the autumn of 1881, the railroad through the South Pasture was completed, and the first cattle went to Albuquerque by rail, which was a considerably easier and less damaging process than the old drives, and the year's accounts were the best the ranch had ever shown. Olive sat with Cecil over the numbers, and they looked at them together with the particular satisfaction of two people who have worked for something and seen it come right. "Your father would be very pleased," she said. "Yes," Cecil said. "I think he would." He paused. "I also think he would be particularly pleased about the rest of it." "The rest of it," she echoed. "The family," he said, with the directness he had learned to use with the things that mattered most. "The way the house is." "I think he would be very pleased about that." She reached across the ledger and took his hand. "So am I," she said. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for going on 3 years now, with that full, unhidden warmth that she had stopped trying to look away from long ago. "I am going to love you for a very long time," he said. "Yes," she said. "You are." The years that followed built on themselves with the solid accumulation of a well-made thing. The ranch grew, not recklessly but steadily, as a good operation grows when it is managed by people who understand it and respect it. Cecil oversaw the land and the cattle with the same patient, thorough intelligence he had always brought to it, and Olive managed the household and the accounts and the increasing complexity of an expanded operation. And they did all of it together in the way they had always done everything, collaboratively and attentively, and with a great deal of unspoken communication and occasional deep disagreements that they resolved with the same honesty they brought to everything else. Robert grew into a boy who was precise and quiet and deeply interested in how things worked, who followed his father around the ranch from the time he could walk fast enough to keep up, asking the methodical questions of someone who genuinely wants to understand rather than merely to know. He had Olive's organizational intelligence and Cecil's patience, and he was, by the time he was 5, the most serious child Olive had ever encountered, which made his moments of pure child's joy all the more extraordinary. Clara grew into her quietness and turned it into something else, something sharper. She watched everything, and then did what she had decided to do with a determination that surprised everyone except Olive, who recognized it. She was 4 when she decided to learn to ride, and she approached it with the systematic method of someone who had already determined that she would succeed, and she did. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's steady hands and something that belonged entirely to herself, a kind of bright, contained certainty that was all Clara. By 1884, there was also a third child. Another boy, born in March, who they named William, and who arrived into the world with a set of lungs that made Robert and Clara regard each other over his cradle, with the united assessment of two people confronted with an unexpected development. William was different from both his siblings, louder and more exuberant and constitutionally incapable of sitting, still past the age of 1, and he filled the house with a particular energetic warmth that somehow completed something. Domingo retired in the summer of 1884, which he did on his own terms, moving into a small house in Dusty Creek that his daughter's family had built for him on their property. He came back to the ranch every Sunday for dinner, which was understood to be a standing invitation and not negotiable. Tom Whitfield had become foreman the year before, steady and reliable, the permanent expression of slight surprise long since replaced by the settled look of a man in his right place. Patrick was still there, and two others, and the ranch ran with the smooth efficiency of an operation that had found its pace. On a Sunday in the early autumn of 1884, when the cottonwoods were just beginning to turn, and the air had the first edge of the coming cold, Olive stood on the porch of the house her husband had been born in, the house that had become her house, and watched her children in the yard. Robert, 5, was very carefully explaining something to Clara, 4, who was listening with her characteristic attention. William, 6 months, was in his father's arms on the porch steps, studying the yard with the same large eyes he had arrived with. Cecil was standing just below her on the steps, talking quietly to the baby, the way he always talked to the very small children, with the patient attentiveness he gave to everything. The afternoon light was the particular October gold of the New Mexico desert, long and warm and full, and the mountains to the east were the same impossible clarity they had been the first morning she had ridden this road 3 years before, or rather 6 years before now. All 6 of them built one on the other in the solid compound of a life that was not what she had planned, and was therefore what she could never have anticipated. She thought of the woman on the bay mare at the saloon door. She thought of the notice board. She thought of the first cup of coffee on this very porch, Cecil careful and attentive and not what she had expected. She thought of every morning since then, the particular light and the smell of coffee and the sound of boots on floorboards and the voices of her children and the steady presence of the man she had chosen without knowing she was choosing him. Cecil turned and looked up at her from the step, the way he had been looking at her for 6 years. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The first morning," she said, "when I came up that drive," he smiled. "You looked so determined," he said. "Like you had decided something on the road here and were going to see it through regardless." "I had," she said. "I had decided I was going to find a way to manage." "Did you?" he said. She looked at him, at the yard, at the children, at the mountains and the sky and the long golden land. "Considerably more than that," she said. He reached up and took her hand where it rested on the porch railing, and she closed her fingers around his, and the October afternoon spread itself open and unhurried in every direction, full of the particular richness of an ordinary day in a life that had exceeded every expectation, in a place that had given everything it had to 2 people willing to stay and attend and love it back. The ranch was theirs. The life was theirs. The land stretched away to the mountains and the enormous sky, and the cottonwoods shook their gold leaves in the wind. And below the porch William made a small satisfied sound and grabbed his father's finger with a grip that was firm and decisive, in the way of all the Merritts, and the family was whole and the day was good, and the desert held them all.